Ethan leaned against the counter of the family diner, absently wiping a spotless glass. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, painting the worn linoleum floor in shades of amber. He'd grown used to the rhythm of the place, the clang of pots in the kitchen, the hum of the ceiling fan, and the occasional burst of laughter from the few regulars who still frequented the diner. It was his life, a life he hadn't chosen, but one he couldn't abandon either. His younger brother Ryan, on the other hand, had a knack for escaping responsibilities. While Ethan had been buried in schedules and payrolls, Ryan had been traveling the world, sending sporadic updates about exotic beaches and lively cities. Their parents often marveled at Ryan's spontaneity and charm, though Ethan knew all too well the price of that charm: broken promises and unfinished plans. The diner's door jingled, pulling Ethan from his thoughts. He glanced up to see Ryan stroll in, sunglasses perched on his head and a grin plastered on his face. As always, he looked effortlessly carefree. "Ethan, man, this place hasn't changed a bit," Ryan said, his voice filling the quiet diner. Ethan set the glass down and folded the towel. "That's because I'm still here, holding it together," he replied, unable to mask the edge in his voice. Ryan smirked but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he slid onto a stool at the counter. "Got any coffee?" Ethan sighed but poured him a cup. He leaned forward, studying his brother. "What brings you back?" "Mom's been asking about you." Ryan's grin faltered. "Actually, that's why I'm here. I got a call from Dad." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "Mom passed away this morning." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Ethan stared at his brother, his mind scrambling to process the sudden shift in reality. Mom? Gone? He felt the weight of her absence pressing down on him already. The loss of her quiet encouragement, her knowing glances, her steady presence that had anchored him through years of responsibility. Ryan was still talking, but Ethan's ears were ringing. "Dad said there's a letter. Something she left for us." "A letter?" Ethan managed to say, his voice hoarse. Ryan nodded. "Yeah, for both of us. He's expecting us at the house tonight." Ethan wiped his hands on his apron and nodded stiffly. "Fine. I'll close early." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Ethan couldn't remember locking the doors or driving to their childhood home. By the time he arrived, Ryan was already inside, lounging on the couch like nothing had changed. Their father, a quiet and stoic man, sat at the kitchen table, a sealed envelope in his hands. "Here it is," their father said gruffly, sliding the envelope across the table. His eyes were rimmed with red, but he held his composure. "Your mom wrote this for you too. She made me promise you'd read it together." Ethan and Ryan exchanged a look before Ryan reached for the letter, his movements hesitant. He broke the seal and unfolded the paper, clearing his throat. "My dear sons," Ryan began, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "If you're reading this, it means I've gone, and there are things I need to say that I couldn't say while I was here." Ethan's chest tightened as Ryan read on. The letter spoke of love and regret, of pride in both her sons despite their differences. But as the letter neared its end, the tone shifted. "There's a truth about our family I kept hidden for years," Ryan continued, his voice wavering. "It's something you deserve to know, even if it's difficult to hear." Ethan leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What truth?" Ryan scanned the next few lines silently, his face pale. He swallowed hard before reading aloud. "Your father is not your father, Ethan." The room fell into a stunned silence. Ethan's world tilted as his mother's words echoed in his mind. The foundation of everything he thought he knew about his life was crumbling before him. "What the hell does that mean?" Ethan demanded, his voice shaking. He turned to their father, who looked away, shame etched into his face. "I was going to tell you," their father muttered, "but your mother wanted to wait. She thought it would bring you closer, not tear you apart." Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Closer? How does this bring us closer?" Ryan opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again, uncharacteristically at a loss for words. The letter trembled in his hands. Ethan stormed out of the room, his mind racing. All he'd ever done was sacrifice for this family. His dreams, his freedom, everything, And now, it felt like none of it had been real. The diner, the responsibilities, the life he'd built, it all felt like a lie. As he stood on the porch, staring into the fading twilight, Ryan appeared beside him. For once, his brother's carefree mask was gone. "I didn't know either," Ryan said quietly. "But maybe we should figure this out together." Ethan didn't respond. His mother's letter had shattered the fragile balance of their lives, and he wasn't sure how to pick up the pieces. Ethan stayed on the porch long after Ryan had gone back inside, the cool night air doing little to soothe the turmoil in his chest. The weight of his mother's words pressed down on him, the revelation swirling in his mind like a storm. His whole life, he'd clung to the identity his family gave him, the steady son, the responsible one, the cornerstone of a family that often seemed to revolve around Ryan's antics. Now, he wasn't even sure where he stood in the picture. It was Ryan's voice that finally pulled him out of his thoughts. "Dad says you should come in. There's more in the letter." Ethan turned, finding his brother leaning against the doorframe. There was no trace of Ryan's usual nonchalance. For the first time, his younger brother looked just as shaken as he felt. With a deep breath, Ethan followed Ryan inside. Their father was still at the kitchen table, his hands clasped tightly around his coffee mug. The letter lay on the table between them, the words heavy with unanswered questions. "Do you want to read the rest?" Ryan asked, sliding the letter toward Ethan. Ethan hesitated before picking it up, his fingers brushing against the paper as if it might burn him. He cleared his throat and read aloud, his voice steady despite the emotions churning inside him. "Ethan, I hope you understand that the truth doesn't change how much I loved you. You were, and always will be, my son in every way that matters. Your father, the man who raised you, feels the same. But there's a part of your story you deserve to know. Before I met your father, I was in love with someone else." Ethan paused, his throat tightening. He forced himself to continue. "His name was Michael, and we were young and reckless. We had dreams bigger than our small town. But life had other plans. I found out I was pregnant with you, Ethan, just as Michael decided to leave. He wasn't ready to be a father, and I knew I couldn't raise a child alone." Ethan's voice faltered, and he glanced at his father, who stared into his mug, his expression unreadable. "Then I met your father," Ethan continued. "He stepped in when I needed someone most. He loved me despite my past, and he chose to love you, too. He became your father in every way that mattered. We decided together to leave the past behind and build a family. But as much as we tried to bury it, the truth lingered in my heart. I wanted to tell you, but I was afraid of what it might do to you, to us." The room was silent as Ethan set the letter down. His hands trembled, but his voice stayed even. "So, all this time, I was someone else's son." "You're my son," their father said, his voice firm. "I raised you. I've loved you since the day you were born. That doesn't change." Ethan looked at his father, searching for something to hold on to, but the foundation of their relationship felt shaky. "Why didn't you tell me? Why wait until now?" "I wanted to," his father admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "But your mother, she thought it was best to wait. I didn't agree, but I respected her wishes. And now she's gone," Ethan said bitterly. "She drops this bomb and leaves us to deal with it." Ryan leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "Ethan, I get that you're angry, but maybe this is a chance to figure out more about yourself. You've always been so wrapped up in this family. Maybe this is a way to start thinking about what you want." Ethan shot him a glare. "What I want? What I want is to go back to when things made sense." Ryan shrugged. "When did things ever make sense in this family? Look, I'm not saying it's easy, but maybe it's worth trying to find out more. Do you know anything about this Michael guy?" Their father shook his head. "Your mom never talked about him after we got married. I don't know where he went or what he's doing now." Ethan pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. "I don't need to know. He walked out on her. On me. I don't care who he is." "Maybe you don't," Ryan said, standing as well. "But don't you think Mom wanted you to have the choice?" Ethan hesitated at the doorway, Ryan's words echoing in his mind. He didn't want to think about it. Didn't want to acknowledge the cracks in the life he'd worked so hard to hold together. But as much as he wanted to slam the door on the past, he couldn't shake the feeling that his mother's letter was more than just a confession. It was an invitation. An invitation to uncover the truth. And for the first time in his life, Ethan wasn't sure if he could handle it alone. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He stared at the ceiling of his childhood bedroom, the memories of his mother and their life together swirling in his mind. Every corner of the room felt like a ghost of the past. Trophies from school competitions, framed photos of family vacations, and the comforting smell of wood polish she always used. It all felt tainted now, as if her letter had rewritten the story of their family in an instant. By morning, he had made up his mind. If he was going to make sense of this, he needed answers. He needed to know who Michael was. Downstairs, Ryan was already at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone. He looked up as Ethan entered, his eyebrows raised. Rough night? Ethan didn't respond. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from his brother, staring into the dark liquid as if it held the answers he was looking for. "I'm going to find him," Ethan said finally, his voice quiet but firm. Ryan set his phone down, leaning forward. "Michael?" Ethan nodded. "I need to know who he is, why he left, what he was thinking when he decided I wasn't worth staying for." Ryan studied him for a moment, his usual smirk replaced by something that almost looked like respect. "You sure you want to do this?" "No," Ethan admitted, "but I don't think I have a choice." Ryan nodded slowly, then picked up his phone. "Well, let's start digging." Ethan frowned. "What are you doing?" "Helping you," Ryan said matter-of-factly. "You think I'm going to let you go on some soul-searching mission alone? Come on, man. You might need backup." Ethan wanted to protest, to tell Ryan that this wasn't his problem, but a small part of him felt relief. He didn't know if he could face this alone, and for once, his brother's brash confidence felt like something he could lean on. Over the next few hours, they combed through old records and online searches, piecing together fragments of information. Their father reluctantly provided a few details, Michael's last name, the small town he'd come from, but it wasn't much to go on. Still, Ryan was relentless, clicking through search results and making calls with the ease of someone who thrived on challenges. By mid-afternoon, they had a lead. A Michaelar, living in a neighboring state, his address listed under a landscaping business. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "You ready for a road trip?" Ryan asked, tossing his keys in the air. Ethan hesitated. The thought of confronting the man who had abandoned him filled him with a mix of dread and anticipation. But he nodded. "Let's go." The drive was quiet at first, the hum of the road filling the silence between them. Ethan stared out the window, his thoughts racing. What would he say to Michael? What if the man didn't want to see him? Worse, what if he didn't remember him at all? "Hey," Ryan said, breaking the silence. "You don't have to do this, you know." Ethan glanced at him. "I do." Ryan nodded, as if he understood. "Okay, just remember, whatever happens, you're still you. Nothing this guy says or does changes that." Ethan didn't respond, but the words settled in his chest, a small comfort in the midst of uncertainty. They arrived at the address just as the sun was setting, the sky streaked with orange and pink. The house was modest, with a neatly trimmed lawn and a few potted plants on the porch. A truck sat in the driveway, the logo of the landscaping business painted on the side. Ethan's hands trembled as he got out of the car. He stared at the front door, his feet rooted to the ground. "You want me to go with you?" Ryan asked, his voice unusually soft. Ethan shook his head. "No, I need to do this myself." Ryan nodded and leaned against the car, watching as Ethan made his way up the path. Each step felt heavier than the last, his heartbeat loud in his ears. He hesitated at the door, his hand hovering over the doorbell. Finally, he pressed it. The sound echoed through the quiet evening, and a moment later, the door opened. A man stood there, his hair streaked with gray but his posture still strong. His eyes, sharp and familiar, locked onto Ethan's, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan swallowed hard. "Are you Michael?" The man frowned, his eyes narrowing. "Who's asking?" Ethan took a deep breath, steadying himself. "My name is Ethan. I'm your son." Michael's expression froze, his eyes widening in shock. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he stepped back, his hand gripping the doorframe as if to steady himself. "I think we need to talk," Ethan said, his voice firm despite the knot in his stomach. Michael nodded slowly, his face pale. Yeah, I guess we do." As Ethan stepped inside, the weight of the past pressed heavily on his shoulders. He didn't know what answers he would find here, but he knew one thing for sure. His life was about to change forever. Ethan followed Michael into the small living room, his heart hammering in his chest. The space was modest but neat, filled with signs of a quiet, solitary life. Books stacked on a side table, a faded armchair, and a worn photograph of a much younger Michael on the mantel. Michael gestured toward the couch, but Ethan hesitated, unsure if he should sit. Instead, he stood by the window, staring at the darkening sky outside. The silence between them grew thick, heavy with unspoken words. "You're my son," Michael said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a question, but a statement laced with disbelief. "That's what Mom said," Ethan replied, his tone sharper than he intended. He turned to face the man, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "But I guess you already knew that." Michael flinched, guilt flashing across his face. "I knew, but your mother made it clear I wasn't welcome. She told me she didn't want me in your life. Said it would be better for you that way." Ethan frowned, his jaw tightening. "So you just left? No fight, no argument, just gone?" Michael exhaled slowly, sinking into the armchair. "It wasn't that simple." "It seems pretty simple to me," Ethan snapped. "You walked away. And now, decades later, I find out the truth in a letter. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" Michael rubbed a hand over his face, his shoulders slumping. "I deserve that. I won't make excuses. I made mistakes, ones I've regretted every day since." Ethan didn't know what he had expected. Anger, denial, maybe even tears. But the quiet remorse in Michael's voice caught him off guard. For a moment, he saw a man burdened by the weight of his own choices, not the selfish figure he had imagined on the drive over. "Why didn't you try?" Ethan asked, his voice softer now. "Why didn't you reach out, even once?" Michael looked up, his eyes filled with pain. "Your mother was the strongest person I ever met. When she told me to stay away, I believed her. I thought she knew what was best for you. And then, as the years passed, I convinced myself it was too late, that you were better off without me." Ethan sat down on the edge of the couch, his anger ebbing into something more complicated. "Do you know anything about my life? Did you ever try to find out?" Michael shook his head. "No, I didn't think I had the right. I didn't even know if you'd been told about me." "Well, now I know," Ethan said bitterly, "and it's left me questioning everything. My family, my identity, everything I thought I was." Michael leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You're not just a part of me, Ethan. You're so much more than that. From the little I've heard tonight, you're strong, responsible, and brave. That's all you. That's not me, and it's not your mom. It's you." The words landed heavier than Ethan anticipated, loosening a knot in his chest he hadn't realized was there. For a moment, he allowed himself to wonder if there could be something salvageable here, some thread of connection that could make sense of the chaos. The sound of a car door slamming outside jolted them both. Ethan turned to see Ryan walking up the path, carrying 2 cups of coffee from a drive-thru. "I figured you'd need backup eventually," Ryan called through the open door as he stepped inside, handing Ethan a cup. He glanced at Michael, offering a nod. "You must be Michael." Michael straightened, eyeing Ryan warily. "And you are?" "Ryan," he said, leaning casually against the wall. "Ethan's brother. Well, half-brother, I guess. But we don't really do labels like that." Michael blinked, his confusion evident. "Half-brother?" "Yeah, I know, weird situation," Ryan said breezily. "But the way I see it, Ethan and I have been through enough together to make bloodlines irrelevant." Ethan stared at Ryan, caught off guard by the declaration. His brother was unpredictable and often frustrating, but in this moment, he was exactly what Ethan needed. Michael shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flicking between the 2 brothers. "You seem close." We are, Ethan said, his voice steadier now. But that doesn't mean there isn't room for more. The admission surprised even him, but as the words left his mouth, they felt right. He wasn't ready to forgive Michael completely or forget the years of absence, but he could feel the faintest crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. Michael nodded, his expression softening. I'd like that, if you're willing. Ethan hesitated, then stood and extended a hand. We'll see, but I'm willing to try. Michael shook his hand, his grip firm but trembling slightly. Ryan watched the exchange with a small smile, raising his coffee in mock celebration. Well, Ryan said, looks like we're not as messed up as I thought. Progress, right? Ethan couldn't help but chuckle, shaking his head. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a glimmer of hope, not just for answers, but for a future that didn't have to be defined by the past. The weeks after the meeting with Michael were a blur for Ethan. He returned home with more questions than answers, yet a quiet sense of resolve had begun to take root. It wasn't easy to process everything, his identity, his family's secrets, and the new connection he was cautiously building with Michael. But for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that things could be different. One Sunday afternoon, Ethan found himself sitting on the porch of his childhood home, a cup of coffee warming his hands. The diner was closed for the day, and Ryan had insisted on spending the weekend helping their father clean out the garage. It was, in Ryan's words, the least I can do after dodging real work for most of my life. Ethan chuckled to himself as he heard Ryan shouting dramatically from inside about a spider. His brother's antics, though exhausting at times, had become a constant source of lightness in recent weeks. The bond between them felt stronger, freer, like they had both stepped out from under the weight of unspoken expectations. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway drew Ethan's attention. Michael stepped out, looking hesitant but determined, a small envelope clutched in his hand. I hope I'm not intruding, Michael said as he approached, his voice careful. Ethan gestured to the empty chair next to him. No, you're fine. Sit. Michael sat down, the envelope still in his hands. For a moment, they simply sipped their coffee, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard. I brought something for you, Michael said finally, holding out the envelope. I've been working on this for a while. It's everything I remember about your mom. About us. I thought you might want to know more. Ethan took the envelope, his fingers brushing over the worn edges. He hesitated, then nodded. Thanks. Michael leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the horizon. You know, meeting you has been the hardest and best thing that's ever happened to me. I thought I'd lost my chance to be part of your life. I never imagined you'd give me this opportunity. Ethan glanced at Michael, his heart softening. I'm still figuring out what this means. For both of us. But I think Mom would have wanted me to try. Michael smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. She was an incredible woman. Strong, stubborn, and full of love. You remind me of her. The words hit Ethan in a way he didn't expect, filling him with a sense of pride and connection. For so long, he had defined himself by his responsibilities and the expectations of others. Now, he was beginning to see himself as more than that, someone shaped by love, resilience, and his own choices. Ryan's voice broke the moment. Hey, you two having a heart-to-heart without me? Rude. Ethan and Michael turned to see Ryan stepping out of the house, his hands covered in dust but his grin as wide as ever. He flopped into a chair next to Ethan, stealing a sip of his coffee. So, Ryan said, when's the next family road trip? I'm thinking we track down some long-lost cousins. Maybe find out if we've got a rich uncle who'll leave us a fortune. Ethan rolled his eyes, but he couldn't help laughing. One family revelation at a time, Ryan. Michael chuckled, the sound tentative but genuine. I think I'll need some time to recover before the next adventure. Ryan leaned back, his arms behind his head. Fair enough. But don't think you're off the hook. You're part of this circus now, whether you like it or not. Ethan looked at his brother, then at Michael, and felt a surprising sense of peace. The past had been messy, painful, and full of unanswered questions, but the future felt wide open. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't carrying the weight of everything alone. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the yard in a warm golden glow, Ethan smiled to himself. The family he had was far from perfect, but it was his, and that was enough.